May it please the tribunal, the handful of selected documents which I presented on yesterday constitute a cross-section of the aggressive war case as a whole. They do not purport to cover the details of any of the phases of the aggressive war case. In effect, they do amount to a running account of the entire matter. Before moving ahead with more detailed evidence, I think it might be helpful to pause at this point to present to the tribunal a chart. This chart presents visually some of the key points in the development of the Nazi aggression. The tribunal may find it helpful as a kind of visual summary of some of the evidence received yesterday, and also as background for some of the evidence which remains to be introduced. I'm quite certain that as your minds go back to those days, you remember the maps that appeared from time to time in the public press. As these tremendous movements developed in Europe. I'm quite certain that you must have formed the concept, as I did in those days, of the gradually developing head of a wolf. In that first chart, you only have an incipient wolf. He lacks a lower jaw, the part shown in red. But when that wolf moved forward and took over Austria, the Anschluss, that red portion became solid black, became the jaw of the wolf. And when that lower jaw was acquired, Czechoslovakia was already with its head and the main part of its body in the mouth of the wolf. Then on chart 2, you see the mountainous portions, the fortified portions of Czechoslovakia. In red, you see the Sudetenland territories, which were first taken over by the Pact of Munich, whereupon Czechoslovakia's head became diminutive in the mouth of the wolf. And in chart 3, you see the diminutive head in red, with its neck practically broken. And all that was necessary was the taking over of Bohemian Moravia. And the wolf's head became a solid black blot on the map of Europe, with arrows indicating incipient further aggressions, which of course occurred. That's a visual picture that I have never been able to wipe out of my mind because it seems to demonstrate the inevitability of everything that went along after the taking over of Austria. The detailed, more or less chronological presentation of the aggressive war case will be divided into 7 distinct sections. The first section is that concerning preparation for aggression during the period of 1933 to 1936, roughly. The second section deals with aggression against Austria. The third section deals with aggression against Czechoslovakia. The fourth section deals with aggression against Poland and the initiation of actual war. For reasons of convenience, the details of the Polish section will be presented after the British Chief Prosecutor presents his opening statement to the tribunal. The fifth section deals with the expansion of the war into a general war of aggression by invasions into Scandinavia, the lowlands, and the Balkans. The details on this section of the case will be presented by the British Chief Prosecutor. The sixth section deals with aggression against the Soviet Union, which I shall expect to present. For reasons of convenience again, the details on this section, like the detail on aggression against Poland, will be presented after the British prosecutor has made his opening statement to the tribunal. The seventh section will deal with collaboration with Italy and Japan and the aggression against the United States. I turn now to the first of these sections, the part of the case concerning preparation for aggression during the period 1933 to 1936. The particular section of the indictment to which this discussion addresses itself is paragraph Roman 4, F, and subparagraph 2, A, B, C, D, E, and F, which I need not read at a glance. The tribunal will recall the allegation. It will be necessary was preceded by a plan of action and a careful coordination of all participating forces. At the same time, each point was part of a long prepared plan of aggression. Each represents a necessary step in the direction of the specific aggressions which were subsequently committed. To develop an extensive argument would perhaps be the unnecessary laboring of the obvious. What I intend to say is largely the bringing to light of information disclosed in illustrative documents which were hitherto unavailable. The three things of immediate international significance referred to in this paragraph 4F2 of the indictment are first, the withdrawal from the Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations. Second, the institution of compulsory military service. And third, the reoccupation of the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. Each of these steps was progressively more serious in the matter of international relations. In each of these steps, Germany anticipated the possibility of sanctions being applied by other countries, and in particular a strong military action from France with the probable assistance of England. However, the conspirators were determined that nothing less than a preventive war would stop them. And they also estimated correctly that no one or combination of the big powers would undertake the responsibility for such a war. The withdrawal from the Disarmament Conference and from the League of Nations were, of course, actions that did not violate any international obligation. The League Covenant provided the procedure for withdrawal. However, in this case, and as part of a bigger plan, the significance of these actions cannot be disassociated from the general conspiracy and the plans for aggression. The announcement of the institution of universal military service was a more daring action with a more overt significance. It was a violation of Versailles, but they got away with it. Then came the outright military defiance, the occupation of the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. Still on indictment paragraph Roman 4F2, which alleges the determination of the Nazi conspirators to remove the restrictions of Versailles. The fact that the Nazi plans in this respect started very early is not only confirmed by their own statements, but they boasted about their long planning and careful execution. I read to you yesterday at length from our Exhibit 789 PS, Exhibit USA 23, Hitler's speech to all Supreme Commanders, 23 November 1939. I need not read it again. He stated there that his primary goal was to wipe out Versailles. After 4 years of actual war, the defendant Jodl, as Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, delivered an address to the Reich and to the Gauleiters, in which he traced the development of German strength. The seizure of power to him meant the restoration of fighting sovereignty, including conscription, occupation of the Rhineland, and rearmament, with special emphasis on modern armored and air forces. our further incursions into Scandinavia in the direction of the Mediterranean and in that of Russia. These also aroused no doubts concerning the general conduct of the war so long as we were successful. It was not until more serious setbacks were encountered and our general situation began to become increasingly acute that the German people began to ask itself whether perhaps we had not undertaken more than we could do and set our aims too high. To provide an answer to this questioning and to furnish you with certain points of view for use in your own explanatory activities is one of the main points of my present lecture. I shall divide it into three parts. One, a review of the most important questions of development up to the present. Two, consideration of the present situation. Three, the foundations of our morale and our confidence in victory. In view of my position as military advisor to the Führer, I shall confine myself in my remarks to the problems of my own personal sphere of action. Fully appreciating at the same time that in view of the protean nature of this war, I shall in this way be giving expression only to one side of events. One, the review. The fact that the National Socialist movement and its struggle for internal power were the preparatory stage of the outer liberation from the bonds of the dictate of Versailles is not one on which I need enlarge in this circle. I should like, however, to mention at this point how clearly all thoughtful regular soldiers realize what an important part has been played by the National Socialist movement in reawakening the will to fight the Wehrwillen, in nurturing fighting strength, Wehrkraft, and in rearming the German people. In spite of all the virtue inherent in it, the numerically small Reichswehr would never have been able to cope with this task, if only because of its own restricted radius of action. Indeed, what the Führer aimed at, and has so happily been successful in bringing about, was the fusion of these two forces. The seizure of power. I invite the tribunal's attention to the frequency with which that expression appears in all of these documents. The seizure of power by the Nazi Party. In its turn had meant, in the first place, the restoration of fighting sovereignty. That's the German word Wehrhoheit. kind of a euphemism, the highness of defense. I think it really means fighting sovereignty. Conscription, occupation of the Rhineland, and rearmament, with special emphasis being laid on the creation of a modern armored and air arm. 3, the Austrian Anschluss. Anschluss means locking onto, I think. They latched on to Austria. The Austrian Anschluss, in its turn, brought with it not only the fulfillment of an old national aim, but also had the effect both of reinforcing our fighting strength and of materially improving our strategic position. Whereas up till then, the territory of Czechoslovakia had projected in a most menacing way right into Germany, a wasp waist in the direction of France, and an air base for the Allies, in particular Russia. Czechoslovakia herself was now enclosed by pincers. Now, I wish the tribunal would contemplate the chart a moment and see that worm-like form of Czechoslovakia, which General Jodl calls a wasp waist in the direction of France. And then he very accurately described what happened when Austria was taken by the Anschluss, that the wasp waist was enclosed in the pincers. I resume reading. Its own strategic position had now become so unfavorable that she was bound to fall a victim to any attack pressed home with rigor before effective aid from the West could be expected to arrive. This possibility of aid was furthermore made more difficult by the construction of the Westwall, the West Wall, which, in contradistinction to the Maginot Line, was not a measure based on debility and resignation, but one intended to afford rear cover for an active policy in the East. 4, the bloodless solution of the Czech conflict in the autumn of 1938 and the spring of 1939, that's the 2 phases of Czechoslovakia, and the annexation of Slovakia, rounded off the territory of Greater Germany in such a way that it now became possible to consider the Polish problem on the basis of more or less favorable strategic premises. I think it needs nothing more than a glance at the progressive chart to see what those favorable strategic premises were. Five, this brings me, said General Jodl, to the actual outbreak of the present war. And the question which next arises is whether the moment for the struggle with Poland, in itself unavoidable, was favorably selected or not. The answer to this question is all the less in doubt since the opponent, that is Poland, after all not inconsiderable in himself, collapsed unexpectedly quickly, and the Western powers, who were his friends, while they did declare war on us and form a second front, yet for the rest made no use of the possibilities open to them of snatching the initiative from our hand. Concerning the course taken by the Polish campaign, nothing further need be said beyond that it proved in a measure which made the whole world sit up and take notice a point which up to then had not been certain by any means, that is, the high state of efficiency of the young armed forces of Greater Germany. If the court please, there's a long review by General Jodl in this document. I could read it on with interest and some enthusiasm. But I believe I have read enough to show that General Jodl, by this document, identifies himself fully with the Nazi movement. This document shows that he was not a mere soldier. Insofar as he is concerned, it identifies the military with the political. And the immediate point on which I had offered the document was to show the deliberation with which the Treaty of Versailles was abrogated by Germany and the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland was militarized and fortified. In one of Adolf Hitler's reviews of the 6-year period between his ascendancy to power and the outbreak of hostilities, he not only admitted but boasted about the orderly and coordinated long-range planning. I bring up again, if the tribunal please, the document L-79, which was offered in evidence on yesterday as Exhibit USA 27. That's the minutes of conference of the Führer by Schmundt, his adjutant. In as large a staff as ours, we inevitably fall into a kind of patois, or lingo, as Americans say. We always refer to this as Little Schmundt. The large file that I offered on yesterday we call Big Schmundt. In that document, what's the page? At this point, I merely wish to read 2 sentences from page 1 of that document, which we call Little Schmundt. One sentence on page 1. It's down below the middle of the page. In the period 1933-1939, progress was made in all fields. Our military situation improved enormously. And then just above the middle of the second page of the English translation, the period which lies behind us has indeed been put to good use. All measures have been taken in the correct sequence and in harmony with our aims. One of the most significant direct preparations for aggressive war is found in the secret Reich Defense Law of 21 May 1935. What's the serial number of that right here? Which I offered in evidence yesterday as Exhibit USA 24 and commented on extensively. I need not repeat that comment. The law went into effect upon its passage. It stated at the outset that it was made public in Standard, but at the end of it, Adolf Hitler signed a decree ordering that it be kept secret. I commented on that sufficiently on yesterday. General Thomas, or Thomas as we'd call him, who was in charge of the war and armament economy, and for some time a high-ranking member of the German Higher Council, refers to this law as the cornerstone of war preparation. He points out that although the law was not made public until the outbreak of war, it was put into immediate execution as a program of preparation. I asked the tribunal to take judicial notice of General Thomas' work, History of German War and Armament Economy, 1923 to 1944, at page 35. We have the volume here in German so that anyone may examine it who wishes. I don't care to offer the entire volume in evidence unless the court thinks I should. We do give it an exhibit number, Exhibit USA 35, but I simply should like to place it in the files as a reference work, as implementing judicial notice, if that is satisfactory.
You want it simply for the purpose of showing that General Thomas said that law was the cornerstone of war.
Yes.
Well, that has already passed into the record.
Right. But I want to say to counsel for the defendants that the volume's here if they care to consult it at any time.
Very well.
I should have identified it by our number, 2353 PS. This secret law remained in effect until 4 September 1938, at which time it was replaced by another secret defense law, revising the system of defense organizations and directing more detailed preparations for the approaching status of mobilization, which I think was a euphemism for war. These laws will be discussed more extensively in connection with other sections of our presentation. They have been discussed by Mr. Dodd in connection with the economic preparation for war. The second secret defense law I offer in evidence as our serial number 2194 PS. I offer it as Exhibit USA 36. As to that document, I only intend to read the two covering letters. Reich Defense Law, the Ministry for Economy and Labor, Saxony, Dresden, and 6/4 September 1939. TEL, I suppose, telegraph, 52151, long distance, 52051. Top secret.
Does this occur at the beginning of 2194 PS?
It should, yes, sir, unless my English mimeograph is different from yours.
Well, mine begins Reich Defense Law.
Yes, sir, I started with that.
But I don't think I've got a letter.
Sir?
I don't think I've got any letter introducing it.
Well, doesn't that start after that to the Reich Protector in Bohemia and Moravia?
Yes, that's right, yes. Absolutely, I beg your pardon.
Transportation section. Attention of construction chief, Councilor Hirsch's, Hirches, or representative in the office. Stamp, the Reich Protector in Bohemia and Moravia. Received Prague, 5 September 1939, number 274. Enclosed, please find a copy of the Reich Defense Law of 4 September 1938 and a copy each of the decrees of the Reich Minister of Transportation dated 7 October 1938, RL 10.2212, diagonal 38, top secret, and of 17 July 1939, RL diagonal LV 1.2173, diagonal 39, top secret, for your information and observance, by order signed Kretschmar. Three enclosures completed at Dresden, 4 September 1939. Signed Schneider, 3 enclosures. Receipt for the letter of 4 September 1939 with 3 enclosures, signed 5 September 1939, and returned to Construction Councilor Kretschmar. You need to read the rest of it. The whole point being that in closing a second secret Reich Defense Law under top secret cover. Now next, I refer to indictment paragraph Roman 4, capital F, 2, little a. That paragraph of the indictment refers to 4 points. 1, secret rearmament from 1933 to March 1935. 2, the training of military personnel, and that includes secret or camouflage training. 3, productions of munitions of war. and 4, the building of an air force. All 4 of these points are included in the general plans for the breach of the Treaty of Versailles and for the ensuing aggressions. The facts of rearmament and of its secrecy are self-evident from the events that followed. The significant phase of this activity, insofar as the indictment is concerned, lies in the fact that all this was necessary in order to break the barriers of the Versailles Treaty and of the Locarno Pact, and necessary to the aggressive wars which were to follow. The extent and nature of those activities could only have been for aggressive purposes. And the highest importance which the government attached to the secrecy of the program is emphasized by the disguised financing, both before and after the announcement of conscription and the rebuilding of the Army. 16 March 1935. Has that been offered? No. I have, if the court please, an unsigned memorandum by the defendant Schacht, dated 3 May 1935, entitled The Financing of the Armament Program. Finanzierung der Rüstung. As I say, it is not signed by the defendant Schacht, but he identified it as being his memorandum in an interrogation on the 16th of October, 1945. I would assume that he would still admit that it is his memorandum. That memorandum has been referred to, but I believe not introduced or accepted in evidence. I identify it by our number 1168BS, and I offer it in evidence as Exhibit USA 37. I think it's quite significant, and with the permission of the court, I shall read the entire memorandum, reminding you that the German interpreter has the original German before him to read into the transcript. Memorandum from Schacht to Hitler. Identified by Schacht as Exhibit A, interrogation 16 October 1945, page 40. May 3, 1935 is the date of the memorandum. Financing of armament. The following explanations are based upon the thought that the accomplishment of the armament program with speed and in quantity is the, underscored the, problem of German politics, that everything else, therefore, should be subordinated to this purpose, as long as the main purpose is not imperiled by neglecting all other questions. Even after March 16, 1935, the difficulty remains that one cannot undertake the open propagandistic treatment of the German people for support of armament without endangering our position internationally. parenthesis, without loss to our foreign trade. The already nearly impossible financing of the armament program is rendered hereby exceptionally difficult. Another supposition must also be emphasized. The printing press can be used only for the financing of armament to such a degree as permitted by maintaining of the money value. Every inflation increases the prices of foreign raw materials and increases the domestic prices, and is therefore like a snail biting its own tail. The circumstance that our armament had to be camouflaged completely till March 16, 1935, and even since this date the camouflage had to be continued to a larger extent, making it necessary to use the printing press, banknote press, already at the beginning of the whole armament program. While it would have been natural to start it, that is, the printing press, at the final point of financing. In the portefeuille of the Reichsbank are segregated notes for this purpose, that is, armament, of 3,775 millions and 866 millions, altogether 4,641 millions, out of which the armament notes amount to Reichsmarks 2,374 millions, status of April 30, 1935. The Reichsbank has invested the amount of marks under its jurisdiction, but belonging to foreigners, in blank notes of armament. Our armaments are also financed partly with the credits of our political opponents. Furthermore, 500 million Reichsmarks were used for financing of armament, which originated out of the Reich Anleihe, the federal loans placed with savings banks. In the regular budget, the following amounts were provided. For the budget period 1933-34, Reichsmarks 750 millions. For the budget period 1934-35, Reichsmarks 1,100 million. And for the budget period 1935-1936, Reichsmarks 2,500 million. The amount of deficits of the budget since 1928 increases after the budget 1935-36 to 5 to 6 millions of Reichsmarks. This total deficit is already financed at the present time by short-term credits of the money market. It therefore reduces in advance the possibilities of utilization of the public market for the armament. The Reichsfinance Minister, Minister of Finance, correctly points out at the defense of the budget, I quote, as a permanent yearly deficit, blank is an impossibility, as we cannot figure with security with increased tax revenues in amount balancing the budget and any other previous debits. As, on the other hand, a balanced budget is the only secure basis for the impending great task of military policy, I interpolate that evidently the defendant Schacht knew about the impending great military tasks to be faced by Germany. For all these reasons, we have to put in motion a fundamental and conscious budget policy which solves the problem of armament financing by organic and planned reduction of other expenditures, not only from the point of receipt, but also from the point of expenditure, that is, by saving. How urgent this question is can be deduced from the following: that a large amount of task has been started by the state and party. It isn't ever just the state, it's the state and the party, and which is now in process, all of which are not covered by the budget, but from contributions and credits, which have to be raised by industry in addition to the regular taxes. The existing of various budgets side by side, which serve more or less public tasks, is the greatest impediment for gaining a clear view over the possibilities of financing the armaments. A whole number of ministries and various branches of the party have their own budgets, and for this reason have possibilities of incomes and expenses. Though based on the sovereignty of finance of the state, but not subject to the control of the finance minister, and therefore also not subject to the control of the cabinet. Just as on the sphere of politics, the much too far-reaching delegation of legislative powers to individuals brought about various states within the states. Exactly in the same way, the condition of various branches of state and party, working side by side and against each other, has a devastating effect on the possibility of financing. If on this territory concentration and unified control is not introduced very soon, the solution of the already impossible task of armament financing is in danger. We have the following tasks. One, a deputy is entrusted with, I suppose, finding all sources and revenues which have origin in contributions to the federal government, to the state and party, and in profits of public and party enterprises. Two, furthermore, experts entrusted by the Führer have to examine how these amounts were used and which of these amounts in the future can be withdrawn from their previous purpose. Three, the same experts have to examine the investments of all public and party organizations, to which extent, I suppose bad translation means to what extent, this property can be used for the purpose of armament financing. For the Federal Ministry of Finances is to be entrusted to examine the possibilities of increased revenues by way of new taxes or increasing of existing taxes. The up-to-date financing of armaments by the Reichsbank under existing political conditions was a necessity and the political success proved the correctness of this action. The other possibilities of armament financing have to be started now under any circumstances. For this purpose, all absolutely non-essential expenditures for other purposes have not to take place. And the total financial strength of Germany, limited as it is, has to be concentrated for the one purpose of armament financing. Whether the problem of financing, as outlined in this program, succeeds remains to be seen. But without such concentration, it will fail with absolute certainty. Being no sort of a hand in finance myself, I can feel some sympathy with the defendant Sharp as he was wrestling with these problems. 21 May 1935 was a very important date in the Nazi calendar.
Would that be a convenient time to
Yes.
adjourn for 10 minutes?
35 was a very important date in the Nazi calendar. As I've already indicated, it was on that date that they passed the secret Reich defense law, which was our document 2261 PS. The secrecy of their armament operations had already reached a point beyond which they could no longer maintain successful camouflage. And since their program called for still further expansion, they made a unilateral renunciation of the armament provisions of the Versailles Treaty on the same date, 21 May 1935. I refer to Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on 21 May 1935, our document number 2288 PS. We have here the original volume of the Völkische Beobachter, the popular observer, I would suppose, is the correct translation. Volume 48, 1935, 122 to 151, May. And the date 22nd May 1935, which carries a speech under the heading, if I may translate perhaps, the Führer notifies the world of the way to real peace. I offer that part of that volume identified as our number 2288 PS as Exhibit USA 38. And of that, I shall read beginning with the 5th paragraph in the English translation. The Treaty of Versailles was not broken by... I'm starting with the words, the Treaty of Versailles, in the 5th paragraph. The Treaty of Versailles was not broken by Germany unilaterally. But the well-known paragraphs of the Diktat of Versailles were violated and consequently invalidated by those powers who could not make up their mind to follow the disarmament requested of Germany with their own disarmament as agreed upon by treaty. Well, I'm sorry, I said the fifth paragraph. This indicates on page 3. It's after he discusses some general conclusions. And then there's a paragraph numbered 1 that says the German Reich government refuses to adhere to the Geneva resolutions of 17 March. You got it? The Treaty of Versailles was not broken by Germany unilaterally, but the well-known paragraphs of the Diktat of Versailles were violated and consequently invalidated by those powers I'm sorry, may I look at the German original? If the court please, I didn't want to read the whole volume of the Völkische Beobachter.
As it's only a short document you're going to read,
It's only a short extract.
perhaps the document could be taken away from the interpreter
Yes,
and
if
he
I
could
could
follow
look
you.
at it, I think I could find it.
Unwieldy thing.
I'm not very fast in reading German, but I might.
No, but if you read it in English, he will translate it.
Yes, but I want the interpreter to have the German. Do you find the German Reich government refuses to adhere to the Geneva resolutions of 17 March? The Treaty of Versailles was not broken by Germany unilaterally, but the well-known paragraphs of the Diktat of Versailles were violated and consequently invalidated by those powers who could not make up their mind to follow the disarmament requested of Germany with their own disarmament as agreed upon by treaty. 2, because the other powers did not live up to their obligations under the disarmament program, the government of the German Reich no longer considers itself bound to those articles which are nothing but a discrimination of the German nation, I suppose against the German nation, for an unlimited period of time, since through them Germany is being nailed down in a unilateral manner, contrary to the spirit of the agreement. Now, if the tribunal please, needless to say, when I cite Adolf Hitler, I don't necessarily vouch for the absolute truth of everything that he presents. This is a public speech he made before the world, and it's for the tribunal to judge when he's presenting a pretext or when he's presenting the truth. In conjunction with other phases of planning and preparation for aggressive war, there were various programs for direct and indirect training of a military nature. This included not only the training of military personnel, but also the establishment and training of paramilitary organizations, such as the police force, which could be and were absorbed by the Army. These are shown in other parts of the case presented by the prosecution. However, the extent of this program for military training is indicated by Hitler's boast of the expenditure of 90 billion Reichsmarks during the period of 1933 to 1939 in the building up of the armed forces. I have another volume of the Völkische Beobachter, volume 52, 1939. At page, the issue of 2 and 3 September 1939. Which I offer in evidence as Exhibit USA 39. And that there appears a speech by Adolf Hitler with his picture under the heading which, if I may be permitted to try to translate, reads, "The Führer announces the battle for the justice and security of the Reich." Show that time. I hand the original volume. Listen, that is a speech, if the court please, by Adolf Hitler on 1 September 1939, the date of the attack on Poland. Identified by our number 2322 PS. And I read from that the paragraph indicated to the interpreter For more than 6 years now, I beg your pardon, on the court's mimeograph copy, it's at the bottom of page 3. The last starting paragraph on the page. For more than 6 years now, I have been engaged in building up the German armed forces. During this period, more than 90 billion Reichsmarks were spent building up the Wehrmacht. Today, ours are the best equipped armed forces in the world, and they are superior to those of 1914. My confidence in them can never be shaken. The secret nature of this training program and the fact of its early development is illustrated by a reference to the secret training of flying personnel back in 1932, as well as the early plans to build a military air force. A report was sent to the defendant Hess in a letter from one Schickedanz to the defendant Rosenberg for delivery to Hess. I suppose that Schickedanz was very anxious that no one but Hess should get this letter, and therefore sent it to Rosenberg for personal delivery to Hess. This document points out that the civilian pilots should be so organized as to enable their transfer into the military Air Force organization. The letter is our document 1143 PS, dated 20 October 1932. And I offer it in evidence as United States Exhibit 40. It starts Lieber Alfred. Referring to Alfred Rosenberg, and is signed mit bestem Gruß, dein Arno. Arno, I think, was the first name of Schickedanz. Dear Alfred, I am sending you enclosed a communication from the RWM, forwarded to me by our confidential man, Vertrauensmann, which indeed is very interesting. I believe we will have to take some steps so that the matter will not be procured secretly for the Stahlhelm. This report is not known to anybody else. I intentionally did not inform even our long friend. I suppose that means our tall friend. I may interpolate that the defendant Rosenberg, in an interrogation on 5th October 1945, identified this long friend or tall friend as being one von Alvensleben. I am enclosing an additional copy for Hess and ask you to transmit the letter to Hess by messenger, as I do not want to write a letter to Hess for fear that it might be read somewhere. Mit bestem Gruß, your Arno. And then enclosed with that is Air Force organization. Purpose, preparation of material and training of personnel to provide for the case of the armament of the Air Force. Entire management as a civilian organization will be transferred to Colonel von Wilberg, at present commander of Breslau, who, retaining his position in the Reichswehr, is going on leave of absence. A, organizing the pilots of civilian airlines in such a way as to enable their transfer to the Air Force organization. B, prospects to train crews for military flying, training to be done within the organization for military flying of the Stahlhelm, that means the steel helmet, I believe, which is being turned over to Colonel Haenel, retired. All existing organizations for sport flying are to be used for military flying. Directions on kinds and tasks of military flying will be issued by the Stahlhelm Directorate. The Stahlhelm organization will pay the military pilots marks 50 per hour flight. These are due to the owner of the plane in case he himself carries out the flight. They are to be divided in case of non-owners of the plane between flight organization proprietor and crew in the proportion of 10 to 20 to 20. Military flying is now paid better than flying for advertisement. 40. We therefore have to expect that most proprietors of planes or flying associations will go over to the Stahlhelm organization. It must be achieved that equal conditions will be granted by the RWM, also the NSDAP organization. The program of rearmament and the objectives of circumventing and breaching the Versailles Treaty are forcefully shown by a number of Navy documents showing the participation and cooperation of the German Navy in this rearmament program, secret at first. When they deemed it safe to say so, they openly acknowledged that it had always been their objective to break Versailles. In 1937, the Navy High Command published a secret book entitled The Fight of the Navy Against Versailles, 1919 to 1935. The preface refers to the fight of the Navy against the unbearable regulations of the peace treaty of Versailles. The table of contents includes a variety of Navy activities, such as saving of coastal guns from destruction as required by Versailles, independent armament measures behind the back of the government and behind the back of the legislative bodies, resurrection of the U-boat arm, economic rearmament, and camouflaged rearmament from 1933 to the freedom from the restrictions in 1935. This document points out the significant effect of the seizure of power by the Nazis in 1933 on increasing the size and determining the nature of the rearmament program. It also refers to the far-reaching independence in the building and development of the Navy, which was only hampered insofar as concealment of rearmament had to be continued in compliance with the Versailles Treaty. With the restoration of what was called the military sovereignty of the Reich in 1935, the reoccupation of the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, the external camouflage of rearmament was eliminated. We have, if the court please, a photostat of the German printed book to which I have referred. Entitled Der Kampf der Marine gegen Versailles, the fight of the Navy against Versailles, 1919 to 1935, written by Sea Captain Schussler, Schussler. It has the symbol of the Nazi Party with the swastika and the spread eagle on the cover sheet, and it's headed secret underscored. It's our document C-156. It is a book of 76 pages of text, followed by index lists and charts. I offered in evidence as Exhibit USA 41. I may say that the defendant Rader identified this book in a recent interrogation and explained that the Navy tried to fulfill the letter of the Versailles Treaty and at the same time to make progress in naval development. I should like to read from this book, if the court please. I certainly shall not read the book. But I should like to read the preface and one or two other portions of the book. The object and aim of this memorandum, under the heading preface, is to draw a technically reliable picture based on documentary records and the evidence of those who took part of the fight of the Navy against the unbearable regulations of the Peace Treaty of Versailles. It shows that the Reich Navy, after the liberating activities of the Free Corps and of Skipper Flo, did not rest, but found ways and means to lay with unquenchable enthusiasm, in addition to the building up of the 15,000-man Navy, the basis for a greater development in the future and so create, by the work of soldiers and technicians, the preliminary condition for a later rearmament. It must also distinguish more clearly the services of these men who, without being known in wide circles, applied themselves with extraordinary zeal in responsibility in the service of the fight against the peace treaty. Thereby stimulated by the highest feeling of duty, they risked, particularly in the early days of their fight, themselves and their positions unrestrainedly in the partially self-ordained tasks. This compilation makes it clearer, however, that even such ideal and ambitious plans can be realized only to a small degree if the concentrated and united strength of the whole people is not behind the courageous activity of the soldier. Only when the Führer had created the second and even more important condition for an effective rearmament in the coordination of the whole nation and in the fusion of the political, financial, and spiritual powers, could the work of the soldier find its fulfillment. The framework of this peace treaty, the most shameful known in world history, collapsed under the driving will of this united will, under the driving power of this united will. Signed, the compiler. Now I wish to invite the court's attention merely to the summary of contents. Because the chapter titles are sufficiently significant for my present purposes. 1, first defensive actions against the execution of the Treaty of Versailles. In parenthesis, from the end of war to the occupation of the Ruhr, 1923. And under that sub-first, saving of coastal guns from destruction. 2, removal of artillery equipment and ammunition, hand and machine weapons. 3, limitation of destruction in Heligoland. Roman 2, independent armament measures behind the back of Reich government and of the legislative bodies, parenthesis, from 1923 to the Lohmann case, 1927, end the parenthesis. Sub 1, attempt to increase the personnel strength of the Reich Navy. 2, contribution to the strengthening of patriotism among the people. 3, activities of Captain Lohmann. I'm ashamed to say, if the court please, that I'm not familiar with the story about Captain Lohmann. 4, preparation for the resurrection of the German U-boat arm. 5, building up of the Air Force. 6, attempt to strengthen our mine arm, they mean. 7, economic rearmament. 8, miscellaneous measures. A, the NV aerogeodetic, and B, secret evidence. Roman 3, planned armament works countenanced by the Reich government, but behind the back of the legislative bodies. From 1927 to the seizure of power, 1933. Roman 4, rearmament under the leadership of the Reich government in camouflaged form. Parenthesis, from 1933 to the freedom from restrictions, 1935. Now, if the interpreter who has the original German volume would turn to chapter 4, page 75. Do you find Roman 4, Aufrüstung? Concealed rearmament under the leadership of the government of the Reich. Parenthesis, from 1933 until military freedom in 1935. The unification of the whole nation, which was combined with the taking over of power on 30th of January 1933, was of decisive influence on the size and shape of further rearmament. While the second chamber, Reichsrat, approached its dissolution and withdrew as a legislative body, the Reichstag assumed a composition which could only take a one-sided attitude toward the rearmament of the armed forces. The government took over the management of the rearmament program upon this foundation. Then a heading, Development of the Armed Forces. This taking over of the management by the Reich government developed for the armed forces in such a manner that the war minister, General von Blomberg, and through him the three branches of the armed forces, received far-reaching powers from the Reich cabinet for the development of the armed forces. The whole organization of the Reich was included in this work. In view of these powers, the collaboration of the former inspecting body in the management of the secret expenditure was from then on dispensed with. There remained only the inspecting duties of the accounting office of the German Reich. Another heading, Independence of the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. The Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Admiral Raeder, honorary doctor, had received hereby a far-reaching independence in the building and development of the Navy. This was only hampered insofar as the previous concealment of rearmament had to be continued in consideration of the Versailles Treaty. Beside the public budget, there remained the previous special budget, which was greatly increased in view of the considerable credits for the provision of labor which were made available by the Reich. Wide powers in the handling of these credits were given to the Director of the Budget Department of the Navy. Up to 1934, Commodore Schussler, afterwards Commodore Förster, F-O-R-S-T-E. These took into consideration the increased responsibility of the chief of the budget. Another heading, Declaration of Military Freedom. When the Fuhrer, relying upon the strengthening of the armed forces executed in the meanwhile, announced the restoration of the military sovereignty of the German Reich, the last mentioned limitation on rearmament works, namely the external camouflage, was eliminated. Freed from all the shackles which have hampered our ability to move freely on and underwater, on land and in the air for 1.5 decades, and carried by the newly awakened fighting spirit of the whole nation, the armed forces, and as part of it the Navy, can lead with full strength towards its completion the rearmament already underway, with the goal of securing for the Reich its rightful position in the world. If the tribunal please, at this moment I have a new problem about proof which I believe we have not discussed. I have in my hand an English transcription of an interrogation of the defendant Eric Ritter. Of course, he knows he was interrogated. He knows what he said. I don't believe we have furnished copies of this interrogation to defendant's counsel. I don't know whether under the circumstances I am at liberty to read from it or not. If I do read from it, I suggest that the defendant's counsel will all get the complete text of it, of what I read in the transcript.
Has the counsel for Rader, the defendant Rader, any objection to this interrogation being read?
Soweit ich bisher das Verfahren verstanden habe, glaubte ich, dass es sich um ein Verfahren handelt, bei dem entweder Beweis durch Dokumente oder Beweis durch Zeugen erbracht wird. Ich bin überrascht, dass die Anklagebehörde jetzt durch Protokolle von Vernehmungen, bei denen die Verteidigung nicht zugegen war, Beweis führen will. Ich wäre dem Gericht dankbar, wenn ich hören könnte, ob grundsätzlich jede Beweisführung in der Form auch für mich als Verteidiger möglich ist, dass ich Urkunden bringe, in denen Zeugen gehört sind. Also demnach auch Urkunden, in denen ich Zeugen selbst höre, wie die Anklagebehörde, ohne den Zeugen vors Gericht zu stellen.
In future, can you hear? In future, the tribunal thinks that if interrogation of defendants are to be used, copies of such interrogations should be furnished to defendants' counsel beforehand. The question which the tribunal wished to ask you was whether on this occasion you objected to this interrogation being used without such a copy having been furnished to you. With regard to your observation as to your own rights, with reference to interrogating your defendants, the tribunal considers that you must call them as witnesses upon the witness stand and cannot interrogate them and put in the interrogations. The question for you now is whether you object to this interrogation being laid before the tribunal at this stage.
Ich bitte mir zunächst Gelegenheit zu geben, dieses Protokoll zu sehen, bevor es beim Gericht vorgetragen wird. Erst dann werde ich entscheiden können, ob Verhöre verlesen werden können, die ich als Verteidiger nicht kenne.
Very well. We may as well adjourn now. The tribunal will adjourn now, and it anticipates that the interrogation can be handed to you during the adjournment and then can be used afterwards.